So, gute Woche, and once again, shkoyach to Rabbi Weinberg for those inspiring words. Now let's go to our regular weekly halacha shir. I'm going to mute everyone. Just so we have shkoyach to Rabbi Lu for sponsoring this week's shir in honor of the birthday of his wife, Rabbi Hindi. La'orach Yom Shalom Tavis. So the first question, the end of last week's shir, there were a couple that we had discussed about Maftir and Haftorah, and there was a question which I didn't manage to address because we ran out of time, in addition to the fact I wasn't prepared for that question. And it was about what happens when you have two people who both want to have Maftir, they both have Yohrtzeit the same week, and so how do we deal with that? So first of all, we want to understand what's the yichus of Maftir. And the question is a strong question because Maftir could really be given to a child. So why is there this idea of having Maftir? And it's not just mentioned in the Chassidish Sefardi, it's actually mentioned in Ramo, in Shulchan Aruch, about a preference for a person who has Yohrtzeit, in the year of Avelos to have Maftir. So the source which we have over here is from the Sefer in the Motzei Shabbos Bo. The Motzei Shabbos Bo was written by the Monkey Cherov, the Michas Elazar, and so he says as well, as you can see over here in the quote, that Shevadei bal kochach mishum sheyesh bo harbe brochos. The fact that the person says more brochos in the Haftorah instead of saying two brochos. I think I mentioned this last week, but he says I hadn't seen it before. So the fact that you're saying not two brochos but seven brochos, that's a toiva, that's a benefit for the nifter, as mentioned before by the Medrash. The idea of the one who says Kaddish is making a Kiddush Hashem in the name of for the merit of the nifter. And that's one other point here, which he also in the Motzei Shabbos Bo, I'm aware that in numerous Chassidish communities, they do the Maftir, the Shabbos before the Bar Mitzvah. And the Minchas Elazar here, he calls it a minhag bayrus. There's no point in making a celebration the week before, like you have a Shabbos Ufruf. You don't have such a thing before the Shabbos Bar Mitzvah. He doesn't agree with that practice. Now, I just want to share a word of the Rebbe. Someone asked the Rebbe about making a Bar Mitzvah, a celebration in advance. So the Bar Mitzvah celebration is until then, you had like a dominance of the Yetzer Hara. Now the Yetzer Tov is coming in full force. So the Rebbe kind of quite a sharp answer. He says, what's the point of celebrating when you still got the Yetzer Hara in full force? It's premature. The idea of making a premature Bar Mitzvah, the Rebbe doesn't agree with. Once the Nefesh Elikis is there in full force, that's when you can make the celebration. But meanwhile, coming back to the first question, when you've got two people who want to have who have Yohrtzeit the same week, and they both want to have the Maftir. So the person asked, is it better that one should be mevater, should forgo on Maftir and have a regular aliya, or should one have Maftir 1 week and the other one has Maftir the next week? I would actually say both, that they should have the one who's mevater, the one who gives. If we can make another minyan, is better. But if not, the one who forgoes, so he should have a regular aliya. But next week he should have Maftir, because what we discussed last week, if you remember, was the Rebbe's hero to Rabbi Ber Baumgarten, Alav Shalom, that he had missed an aliya the Shabbos before his birthday, should have the week after. So the same thing here. If a person didn't manage to get Maftir the Shabbos before, the Shabbos after is valid. It's also it has a value. I just want to share with you one more thing. There is this, we've been learning in the weekdays, we have every Tuesday, we have a ladies' cheer, and what we've been doing this year, we've been learning through the the dinim of Choshen Mishpat as they are in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, which is more the ethical aspect of Choshen Mishpat rather than the arbitration side of Choshen Mishpat. And we have here in the end of Hilchos Evrei Drochim the question which is very, very relevant in Stamford Hill, when you've got two cars going through the same road and there's not enough space for two cars. So who has to give way for the other? So there's a lot of discussion about that, about two ships, two barges coming through a canal, and one of them is going to have to back up. And how do you reconcile between the two? So he talks about two ways of judgment. There's a judgment which is in who's right and who's wrong. And then there is a judgment which is a way of a pshara, which is to find a compromise. Now, earlier, I didn't quote this on the sheet. Earlier on, he brings these are two ways, two methods, which are both important methods. So when it has here, let's read the halacha inside. You've got here a narrow passage, and there's not enough for both donkeys to go side by side. So one of them is going to have to stop for the other one to pass through. So the rule is, if one of them is laden and one is empty, so the laden one has priority. What happens if both vehicles, ships, donkeys, camels, whatever it may be, if they're both equally have equal status? Here it's talking about when they're both traveling in the same route, not in opposite directions. So he says, both of them want to be in the front. Okay, so you say Yamid par mechod, par mechod. One time you'll be ahead, one time I'll be ahead. Two wagons which are driving. Now, we call it the good old days. In the good old days, you could be stopped by highwaymen. So everyone else was saying, the other one should go front, yeah? Shtei Agolas got two wagons driving through, and each one wants to be the back one. All right, Yosef sure to say, one time you'll be in the back, one time I'll be in the back. That's the other form. There is a form of a clear pshat. You have priority, because you are laden, etc. And when there isn't a clear priority, then there's another way. We'll come to an arrangement. This time I will waive my rights, and you next time you'll waive your rights, and we'll work it out. So what I would say is that when you've got two people who've got this, and there's not enough to make 2 minyanim for separate maftir, okay, 1 year they will, Reuven will be mevatir, and Shimon will have the maftir, and the next year Shimon will be mevatir, and Reuven will have the maftir, and that's the way which he says here. But find a way of a compromise. We should be able to continue, living in peace and harmony. Okay, I got here a question during the week that this coming week we have the Chamisha Shevat, which is colloquially called Tu B'Shvat. I think the Rebbe always used the word Tu B'Chamisha. And so there's a meaning of eating fruit, which is mentioned already in Mogen Avraham, etc. The meaning of eating numerous fruit. But there are those who have a seder of having dafka 15 fruit. And if you take Sefardi Sforim, which is mentioned numerous times, the Rebbe mentioned the Siches about the Sefardi Sforim, how they have a whole tikkun. And there's different type of fruit with shells, without shells, and the whole seder of different fruit. And also saying 15 Shir HaMailos, which is all a very, very beautiful minhag. There's 15 chapters in Tilim from number 120 till number 130 something. And so you've got 15 chapters which start off with Shir HaMailos or Shir HaMailos. So 15 and 15. So there are those who have a minhag of saying Shir HaMailos. If someone asks me that he has a minhag in his family to do this, now usually he would, in the past years, he's done it during the daytime. Is it okay to do it by night? So this is a question of saying Tehillim by night, and it's a question which many people ask, not necessarily in this context, generally about saying Tehillim by night. So let's take a look at a couple of sources. What you have at the top source, which I'm pointing to the top right, is from the Bar Hetiv in Siman Reish Lamed Ches. And that, if you won't remember, this is about Laila. It's after the dinim of Minche and the dinim of Ma'ariv, just before Krishna Shalamita, the idea of having learning by night, learning by Laila. So he has here, Ein likroi mikro balayla. One shouldn't be studying mikro at night. And he has a reference to Shar HaMitzvahs, Parshas Voschanan. So Al Pi Kabbalah, there is an emphasis that Torah Shebal Peh, that Per Shebichsav is by day, and Torah Shebal Peh is by night. I saw a cute thing. I have a sefer. There's a man in Tzfas called Reb Shabsi. I think it's the Shabsi Friedman. He called Birurei Minhagim, I think he has. He sent me the sefer. And so he quotes from somewhere that in Shemayim, when Moshe Rabbeinu was learning the Torah, so although in Shemayim everything is ois v'chet v'bim koimoi, but by day it was like keminig al ha'oretz. So down on the earth, so there's by day is light and by night is dark. So also when Moshe Rabbeinu was learning, he was learning in Midrashim. By day he was learning Torah Shebichsav, and by night he was learning Torah Shebal Peh, for the simple reason. Torah Shebichsav, it has to be light. You can't read without the text. You have to have the lights on. Torah Shebal Peh is after has to be said Bal Peh. So by night is a time for Bal Peh, and by day is a time for reading a text. Call upon him. That's on a nice drushi level. So meanwhile, we have here then this idea of Al Pi Kabbalah. There's the emphasis of mikro. It belongs by day rather than by night. Now then I have here the next quote, which we have over here, is from Sefer HaMinhagim, where he talks about chitas after Shachris. There's a text section about chitas, etc. And we have this quote, Yodua Asher Balai, Yodua. Yodua means it's known, and it means from Sefer Kabbalah. Asher Balaylo, Hochil Mitzvah Kechov Achar Chatzos Halaylo, from when the three stars come out until after midnight. Ein Emrim Tilim. We don't say Tilim. Or Bichlal Zeshir Til Machodshi. Included the monthly quota of per day. That is okay by night. Levad me Rosh Hashanah, Aser Semei Tshuva, Yom Kippurim v'Shana Rabba. These special occasions where one does say Mikra by Laila. And interesting, B'Shana Rabba Gufa La'achei Chatzois. B'Shana Rabba, the first half of the night, we're saying Sefer Dvarim, which is also Tosha B'Chsav, and the second half of the night we're saying Torah. We're saying Tilim. So this is the exception, but overall, generally, one doesn't make a seder of learning Mikra Balayla. So then, this is another, as I was doing a search on this topic, so I see a quote. So this was someone was asked this question about doing the seder of the 15 fruit by night or by day. So this quote Sefer is saying another reason for not doing the seder by night, because there's the meaning of saying the 15 shira milas, and so basically I would say that one should stay, if one wants to do the seder of the tilim, there is a preference to do it by day dafke. Of course, it's not the biggest aveir to say mikra balaylo. It's better if you have nothing else, you do it. But I was asking for guidance. What's the seder? So the seder is we avoid doing a seder of mikra balaylo. Let me get right. So someone sent to me a question this week. So Chumash Rashi, as he said, you can learn by Laila because it's learning with the Mefurish. So someone asked me the question about these Bartanura Joy Van wines. Are there any? Is it mehudar for Kiddush, etc.? So let's go through a couple of things. Number one is yayin mevushal, a maila or a chesaron. So according to Shitas Rambam, yayin mevushal is not kosher for Kiddush. It's not kosher for pouring on the Mizbeach, and the Rambam says, therefore, it's not kosher for Kiddush. If I'm not mistaken, the Rambam would hold that sweetened wine with sugar is not kosher for Kiddush. The halacha does not follow the Rambam, and we do use yayin mevushal, and especially, we discussed this before, where you have a risk that you might have a visitor who's not, who will touch the wine, will make it a problem of you wouldn't make damage to it. So we're not worried about it. Then, so the one who, there's a sefer from the it's called Shuvas Vanhogas, he used to be known as the London Ilur, Moshe Sternbuch. So he raises a problem with the grape juices, that they are made from concentrate, etc. And I see in Minchas Yitzchok, Rav Weiss, originally of, well, for many years he was the Rav in Manchester, then he became the Rav in Yerushalayim. And he says that some people are raising questions about the grape juice on the hechsher of the Eida Chredis, and one of the tainas is that it's made from concentrate. It's not true. It's not made from concentrate. And I've heard this from other sources that the French grape juice, it says isn't it 100% pure. It means it's not made with water. It's made from grape juice, and this whole thing that it's made from reconstituted is generally not the case. That's not the general picture. And now the fact that it's got a bit of carbon added to it, I don't think that I'm reading. I don't see ample grounds for making any trouble, and so therefore I don't see any stronger reason to say that carbonated wine is anything less mehudar for Kiddush. I don't see any reason for it. I might be wrong, but fine. Someone's asking, Eli is asking about, in the winter months, is it okay to start to say Tehillim on Friday night of Shabbos Bo to fit in the short day? Let's go back. Let's go back on the, where was that quote from the Sefer HaMinhagim? He says here, the exceptions he only makes is Rosh Hashanah, Aser Smitchuva, Yom Kippur, Shana Rabbah. He doesn't make an exception of a regular Shabbos. All right, listen. I understand for some people it's a big challenge to fit in Shabbos Mevorchim to say the whole Tehillim. But I don't. At this moment, I don't have a simple answer. I know there was one quote it in the Sefer Nesivim. There was one of the Levertovs, one of the Levertov brothers, who was he was a shamus in a shul in East Flatbush. So he had to walk a long way on Shabbos Mevorchim, and he asked the Rebbe, Poshet doesn't have enough time. He'd go, if he's Flatbush, then come to the Rebbe's Fabrengen. He wasn't able to fit everything in. So the Rebbe told him that whilst he's walking, a lot of Tehillim he knows by heart, because a lot of Tehillim is part of davening. So the Rebbe advised him to take those Tehillim which he knows by heart, he should say whilst he's walking. And then when he comes before or after, he'll say the Tehillim which he doesn't know Balpeh. In that way, the Rebbe gave him an eitzah to cover quite a few Tehillim whilst he's walking. But yeah, I don't have a simple answer. Then came up this week a question, someone asked, about a case of a Rahman al-Itzlan where there's a mixed marriage. Just a minute. Last week I listened to one of the Fabrengens, and Reb David Weitman of Brazil. He was saying he brought a whole group of people from Brazil to the Rebbe, and he was brought in as the interpreter to stand by in case there's a need for an interpretation from Portuguese to Yiddish or whatever it may be, and by him answers the questions. And there was one person there who was intending to get married to a non-Jewish woman, and the Rebbe was very, very blunt to him, and the Rebbe was saying to him, statistically, it's a tragedy. Statistically, such marriages will be full of arguments and strife, and the Rebbe was he didn't how do you say, pull no punches. The Rebbe was very, very clear with him, and the Rebbe says, I give you a blessing, I give her a blessing. Each of you should find the appropriate shidduch, appropriate spouse in a way, but not one another. You should have nothing to do with her. At any rate, but unfortunately, we do have this situation. So now, and the one wants to have a mezuzah. So does one put up a mezuzah with a brocho, without a brocho? And it happens to be, the question was that this woman is a Sefardi and her husband is not Jewish. So here we have a din in Shulchan Aruch. Let's go one thing at a time. We have a din in Shulchan Aruch that a house which belongs to partners, Beis HaShutfin, if two people own a house together, is obliged with a mezuzah. Then he says, Davke Beis HaShutfim Yisraelim. I wonder whether that's a mistake. Perhaps it should be when Beis as in the two, when both of the partners are Jewish. Abel Bayis Shel Yisrael v'Goy, potu mimezuzah. But a partner in a home which is shared between a goy and a yid does not need to have a mezuzah. In this, there are different opinions. Some say that the partnership is poshet, it's al pidin min hatoyru. There's no chiv of mezuzah because it's not beisecho, because of the partnership with the goy. Others say it's only because of a chashash, a concern that the goy might have some issue, and there might be some side issue, but really it is chayiv. That seems to be the position of the Rashba. So what we have over here is a quote from the Birkei Yosef. Now the Birkei Yosef is from the Chidah, who's a eminent Sefardi posek, and he quotes the Rashba. This is the last piece of a long stretch in the Birkei Yosef in the same Siman Resh Pei Vav. And he says, "Le'inyan halacha, nira de'ima da'akum do hador imay v'shutfei bebayis." If the Yid and the Goy are sharing, living together in the same house, kimle begavei, and if he trusts the Goy, that the Goy will not pick up the mezuzah and disgrace it. V'lo yashum sakona, there's no element of danger. Yaniach hayisrael mezuzah bebeisoi, abde yashuftev ba'akum. So although the Ramo, who's Ashkenazi, who says that it doesn't need to have mezuzah, but the Birkei Yosef is saying that if there's no negative issues, then they should put up mezuzah. V'lo yevorech, should make a brocho. So even for Sefardim, although the one who says you shouldn't put it is Ashkenazi, but here you have a Sefardish posek, no brocha. I find it a bit ironic that a woman who's living with a non-Jew should be kind of claiming minek Sefardim, minek Ashkenazim. It's a bit ironic. Someone I heard from someone in Paris, one of the Kurovim, Rabbi Azimov, Alva Shalom. So Rabbi Azimov went all the way. His chevre went all the way to Lubavitch without any. So someone was challenging one of the Kurovim, minek Sefardim, minek Avoisov. So he says, listen, my father had a minig on Shabbos. He would go to the market and sell cloth in the market. That was my father's minig. And actually, this idea that the one who was Mekarev you, that's the minig Avoisov, is actually, I mentioned before, of Moshe Sternbuch. He has a tshuva that the one who's Mekarev, that's called the minhag, which should be applicable for his Mekuravim. Come back. What we have on the left side of the page is from Likutei Diburim. And this is a long story, which I'm not going to go into, that this is the time of Rebbe Yoel Baal Shem, perhaps 100 years before the Baal Shem Tov. And he taught Kabbalah. He taught Megila also, but he had a yeshiva, and he has a Talmud who has a great uncle who's married to a non-Jewish woman, but he loved learning Gemara, and he describes on Shabbos morning he would be sitting smoking a cigarette with a big dog at his feet and sitting and learning Gemara bareheaded. That's how he describes this uncle, great uncle. And the great nephew wants to go, and it was bothering him that his uncle is so knowledgeable and yet so far. And the Yoel Baal Shem gives him a whole seder how he should travel there and what he should do. And so one of the things he says, Vayitein al Yodoi Mezuza, the Rebbe Yoel Baal Shem gave the Talmud a Mezuza. He says the second day you come there to the house of your uncle, your great uncle, after Shachris, you should put up the Mezuza beli brocha, bepesach rishon. The front door put up a Mezuza without a brocha. So this is a shtickle smach. But this idea of because it's a mixed marriage, it also becomes complicated. Who owns the house? La halacha, who owns the house in legal sense? And it may be rented. Who's the legal occupant of the house? It's al kolponim. I would remain just you put up a mezuzah without a brocha, and yeah, right. Let's take a look over here. They get a couple of questions on the chat about saying tilim for a choila. That's an exception. That if there's an urgent situation, one would say tilim at night also, because that's an exceptional situation. It's an emergency. Rabbi Levitansky is asking about making up for Shabbos Mevorchim. If you start after Chatzos, you're absolutely right. That's not always so practical for people, but yes, you're right. If you start from after Chatzos, it's okay. All right, well, the sparkling one, das lassen für ein andermal. The questions are a little bit too complicated for me to deal with now, I think we'll have to leave them for next week. I'll try to keep the chat and address them next week. Let's move on. Now, because of COVID, many people are concerned about, and rightly so, concerned about coming together in close crowds. And therefore, there are those who are thinking of making an open air reading of the Megillah. The problem with open air is that the human voice doesn't project adequately, it gets lost in the wind, etc. So microphones, we'll discuss this. Microphones and loudspeakers, electronic equipment are things which we cannot entertain, la halocha. But what about this trumpet, which is purely, I don't know if the word is mechanical. It just directs the voice into a particular direction. And so would this be acceptable? So let's go through some poskim. We have here on the right side, we have from the Sefer called Shailas Tshuvas Halochos Ktanos. Halochos Ktanos was written by Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz. I didn't trace exactly when he lived. I can tell you the first print was in Venice in the year Tov Samach Vov, I think, which is shortly after the Baal Shem Tov was born. That's when it was printed. So that gives you a little bit of a picture how far back he lived. And he was asked the following about a person who's largely, we'd say, he was hard of hearing. The only way he can hear is by using a trumpet, which he puts into his ear, and he can hear with that. So he says, Nira Poshut, that this person is obliged to hear shofar. The fact that he can't hear normally does not exempt him. If a person is deaf, which means he does not have the sense of hearing at all. But here he uses an interesting expression. If you pick up the lulav in a bag, we discussed this a few months ago. If it's a dover toffel, there's a svara lekicha yedei dover achish mo lekicha. So he says, so you're hearing via an instrument, and he says it's okay. So that's his position, that the person who can only hear shofar through an assistance of a trumpet is chayiv b'shofar and is fulfilling the mitzvah. The next quote we have here is from a sefer called Sharei Dayan. Sharei Dayan is a Talmud of the Tzemach Tzedek, and he becomes a Rav in Frankfurt, I think, and he challenges the position of Kichai de Dover Acher being appropriate to our situation. But what he does say, he also says, Al Kaponim Nishma HaKoil Kemoshehu Mikoich HaMashmiya Afshehu Al Yedei Siyu Adover Acher. The fact that it is assisted, it's enhanced. Oh no, enhanced isn't the right word. It's assisted, it's being directed through another medium. So the fact that it's being assisted doesn't matter. And so I'm not just taking a little bit from a whole long discussion, but he does okay it. Then we have, and we discussed this a while ago, about 4 weeks ago, I mentioned about Ariel Tzimmer and about when they had made this dedication, the stone, the cornerstone for the Yad HaChamisho in Kfar Chabad, and Rabbi Ariel Tzimmer was upset that the Chazan had gone to the Omid with a microphone, and the Rebbe responds about the Minchas Elazar. So this is this piece of Minchas Elazar in Chelik base, Siman Ayin base. And we're not paskening like the Minchas Elazar because he understood that a telephone is relaying the human voice. And the Rebbe took very clearly the position, as did Reb Shlomo Zalman, that a telephone does not relay the human voice. It takes the human voice and changes it into electronic pulses, relays the pulses, and then at the other end, the electronic pulses are changed back into a very good replica of the human voice. And therefore, the Rebbe takes the position that you cannot be Yohrtzeit Megillah through a telephone, etc. But at least I think I can rely on the Minchas Elazar that if it is not electronic, it's purely a director to channel the sound wave in a particular direction, that should be okay. And so let's read the Minchas Elozos. This is the last line. He was asked about being Yohrtzeit Megila through a telephone. So I'm going to read through this horn. So he says it's okay. Because just before that he discussed about a shofar. Shofar, you have this precedent in the Gemara about a person who's in a pit and is blowing shofar and someone else is hearing. Does he hear the voice shofar or does he hear the echo? Shofar is an instrument. You have to hear the shofar for the shofar, not the echo. The echo, but when it comes to Megila, that is not such a problem. The be'em is the Megila leiposal im nisave koila koire b'havoro b'shmiya merochik berichuk makim. The fact that their voice has been a little bit muffled or something, it's not a problem. So as I say, I'm not Chas v'sholem saying that you can be Yohrtzeit Megillah through a telephone or through a radio, etc., because we've clearly heard that dozens of times from the Rebbe, and so that's out of the question for us to be Yohrtzeit. But what I am saying is that a tool like this, which we saw before, this trumpet, which is purely mechanical, not electronical at all, should be acceptable for reading the Megillah, not for shofar, but for Megillah. Okay.
They cost £20 on Amazon.
You could have made some money, make a commission on it. Show it again.
You what?
You had a shayla last week about someone selling on Amazon, and it's someone that people can buy it cheaper. It's allowed, so I should go and not tell him the price.
Looks like me and you are in the wrong job, huh? Okay.
Dank.
Okay, right. I didn't want to use the word megaphone because the megaphone can also be the ones which they use by Lag Boimer rallies. Is got a built-in. It's got a built-in microphone, which is mamish like the same thing as using a telephone, etc., or like a microphone. So therefore, I'm trying to avoid using the word megaphone, or might be before the battery operated. Perhaps this was called a megaphone, but right. Let me get weiter. Okay, weiter. People are asking about Purim Suda. And because it's on Friday, so what's the lechatchila? Now, a lot of shluchim in other times, I don't know whether it's relevant this year. Baruch Hashem, some regions, it is relevant about having guests. And Bezras Hashem, Bekorev by us also. So shluchim, sometimes they invite people for a Suda, and it's a wonderful idea. They bring them for the Suda just before Shabbos. So they have Suda, Megila, Suda, Tefillin, and then they have the Suda Purim. Then after the Suda Purim, then the way ladies bench licht. Then they make Kiddush, and then there's a Shabbos meal, and then there's L'chaim. And if it's very successful, so then the people will not be able to drive back home on Shabbos. And if it's very successful, they won't be able to drive home even tomorrow also. So it's mamish, that's a tremendous success of Shmiras Shabbos. So at any rate, so there is a svara to make dafka a meal close to Shabbos and overflow into Shabbos. But that's obviously so let's read what is the halacha and the recommendation halacha. So now we have here, this is in Siman Tov Reish Tzadik Hey, I think, in the dinim of Purim. The minhag to make the Purim meal is usually done after Mincha. And maybe if you daven by night, and you daven Mincha first, whilst it's still clearly day, and you should have Reiv of the Suda you should have by day, and not like you have just before the evening, before nightfall to start the Suda, and the meal is in the night. That's not recommended. Okay. By the time next year comes around, we'll have forgotten about this because we're busy delivering shlachmonas till mamish, till 10 minutes before. But then the last two lines. When Purim is on a Friday, one should make the meal in the morning. The Purim Suda should be in the morning, So in order not to infringe upon the covered Shabbos, so when it comes Shabbos, you shouldn't be, just eating a full meal. If you just eat a full meal, you're not going to have an appetite for the Sudas Shabbos. So the Purim Suda should be earlier in the day. That's the lechatchila. Having said that, if someone does take this method of having the Purim Suda close to Shabbos, and it's going to overflow into Shabbos, then we have the concept of Pores Mapu Mekadesh. Pores Mapu Mekadesh means that at a given stage during the meal, you're going to cover the challah, you'll make Kiddush, and you'll continue the meal. Then you'll have the Lechem Mishnah, and you continue the meal. So let's go a little bit of detail on that. What's the issue here? That there's a mitzvah to make Kiddush. And because of this, you're not allowed to eat before you've made Kiddush. So now, for other mitzvahs, if you're in the middle of a meal, you don't have to stop the meal. Becomes Kiddush, Kiddush has to be Mokim Suda. So if you're in the middle of a meal and it comes the time for Kiddush, you're going to have to stop the meal and make Kiddush. All right, so now he says, Mikol Mokim, Ein Lo Lahavsik Sudosi Legami, this is Simuresh Ein Aleph, in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. You don't have to stop the meal totally and bench. Ela Yekadesh, I can't get this out of the way. Yekadesh miyad, v'yigme sudosa, you'll make Kiddush and you'll finish your meal. Should be Kiddush became a Suda. So you'll make Kiddush, and then the Suda will be the following Suda. That will be the following meal, that will be your Kiddush b'mokim Suda. Then Sifyud says, at this point, when you're going to make Kiddush, you're going to have to spread a cloth over the table. L'chari means basically the chalas. The chasus hapas, to cover the lechem, koidim sheyikadesh. So you'll make Kiddush in the middle of the meal and you'll cover the chalas for that moment. And then you'll take it away. Then you'll remove the cover. It should give the impression that the bread was brought now, the covered Shabbos. So that's where the term of Pores Mapu Mekadesh. Then becomes the question about brocho. A brocho of Beire Pri Hagofen and of the brocho Hamoitzi Lechem in Haaretz. The first opinion is that if you had wine earlier on in the meal, then you don't make a Hagofen at this Kiddush. You're going to stand up, you can say Yom HaShishi, but then perhaps you should say Savri Moronon to make up your Kabbalah. There should be 72 words. With Yom HaShishi has got 35 words, and the Brocha has got 35 words, and the 2 words of Savri Moronon make up 72. I'll call upon him, I don't know about that. But you wouldn't say Be'er Pri Hagofen because you've had Be'er Pri Hagofen already. So the Be'er Pri Hagofen is still current. So you'd stand up and you make Kiddush without saying Be'er Pri Hagofen. The question is, what about Hamoitzi? Because at the time when you made Kiddush, or you had to make Kiddush, you weren't able to eat. So therefore, that would interrupt the continuity of your Hamoitzi. Others say no. Others disagree with that objection about the Hamoitzi having to repeat Hamoitzi. They say the fact that you had for 15 seconds, you were not able to eat the challah because you're in the middle of making Kiddush, that doesn't mean you finished your meal. Because you intend, the first svara is, there's a din of Sudas Shabbos. So you're making Kiddush, and now it's going to be a new Suda. So you have to make a new Hamoitzi. The other one says, no, they're not convinced with that argument. It's just you have an obstruction. You cannot eat further because you haven't made Kiddush. When the obstruction is taken away, you resume eating. Therefore, the Kiddush is not an interruption, just as if you had davened in the middle of a meal. You don't have to make a new Hamoitzi. So we have here a dilemma. The Hagofen for sure. The Hagofen for sure you don't say if you had Hagofen earlier in the meal. With Hamoitzi, the first opinion earlier, which we don't have on the screen, says you do have to repeat Hamoitzi. The second opinion says you don't have to repeat Hamoitzi. So what will you do? You will not say Hamoitzi because Safek Brachas Lahokil. But the thing is, there's a certain niggling worry. What happens with, according to the first opinion, you're eating without a bracha. Therefore, they advise Bal Nefesh, a person who has greater self-discipline, should avoid the problem. So we see here that there's a certain attitude here in Shulchan Aruch advising against using this whole method of Peres Mappa Mekadesh. I want to say, first of all, someone asking about Lechem Mishnah. So Poskin discussed this, and Bepashitz it means, when he says you should cover the Lechem, it means you should cover the Lechem Mishnah. You'll have Lechem Mishnah, no difference to any other Shabbos, but you won't make a brocho. By the Rabbeim, where there was a Yom Tov coming into Shabbos, there sometimes was be this in your Peres Mappa Mekadesh. I'm not sure whether it was the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the Rebbe Rashab the last year wanted to be Peres Mappa Mekadesh, and the Frierdiker Rebbe was telling him not to bring the wine. They shouldn't be Peres Mappa Mekadesh. There was a whole thing, and that was the year of the Estalkus. And by the Rebbe never himself did Peres Mappa Mekadesh, but he did encourage that there should be someone. In the earlier years, someone would be Peres Mappa Mekadesh, but the Rebbe himself didn't rely on this. So there was a certain reluctance to this Peres Mappa Mekadesh. Then becomes we'll come to the question about what happens with Yom Tov. We'll come to the benching in a moment. I have an eitzah and a question, or after eitzah. One eitzah is, what's the question here? Do you make hamotzi or not? What happens if you'll have one volunteer? Let's say you have a few guests, and they're all verbringing from before, and you have one guest, or one of the bnei bayis, who didn't wash earlier, and he's going to he'll make hamotzi, and he'll be motzi everyone else. He'll make hamotzi loud, and everyone will be yotze. Then you've solved the problem of, but the whole question of Bal Nefesh has been yotze because he for sure has to make hamotzi because he didn't have hamotzi before. And everyone else, if they have to, they'll be yotze. If they're not, it's not a brocho levatom. They just said amen. I have another question. My question. You stand up, you've got the chalos on the table, and you've got here, and you've got a glass of wine. On the glass of wine, you're not making a brocho. On the chalos, you're not making a brocho. What would happen if you make, and it looks like earlier, if you're Peres Mappa Mekadesh and you don't have wine, just challah, it looks like for sure you don't have to make hamotzi. So then I can stand up and say, kapish ma'agali. If I have to make hamotzi, if I have to make hamotzi because I've made Kiddush on wine, so my Kiddush is on the chalas, finished. So problem solved. I can have a monavshach. The Eibusher should sort out whether my Kiddush is on the wine or on the chalas. Of course, it doesn't matter which I'm holding. The chalas are on the table. So I'm asking the question, why is that not a valid solution? Okay. Rabbi Lu adds, it was done by the Rebbe. The Rebbe said, b'shem the previous Rebbe, I guess, that one person, the Rebbe, must behave b'dugma shel mailo. The Rebbe therefore stopped before Shkia. Okay, so he didn't. And what was interesting is, in just a moment, Rabbi Lu, in Tov Shin Chav Zayin, Tov Shin Chav Zayin, the Rebbe on Rosh Hashanah and on Sukkot told them to announce that those who were Yohrtzeit Kiddush by Peres Mappa Mekadesh, when they go home, they can make Kiddush again for the Bnei Bayis. Rabbi Lu.
Yes. No, I'm just saying. Those was early as that, and then at one stage somebody wrote on the chat. At one stage, the Rebbe didn't stop it. And I don't know if he stopped verbringing, but he stopped the Indian of Peres Mappa Mekadesh. They would finish it, and then all the time, earlier years and later years, the kosher brocho was given out on Shabbos afternoon usually, or Motzei Shabbos.
It was a very rare kvius. There should be.
I remember it like a few years. It happened. Once it happened a few times.
Okay.
Whenever it's a 3-day, Thursday, Friday, Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres.
The next question. Yes. So the next question is, what about
Zion?
What happens? What happens with Alanissim? And the question is, once you've already made Kiddush, now I want to say a practical thing. Sometimes there's a chasana on Rosh Chodesh, and then in the middle of the chasana, as many people go outside into the lobby and they make a minyan for Ma'ariv, they come back and they continue the meal. So do you say Yalla v'Yova? You started, let's say the meal was 8 o'clock, and then it was still day, and then it overflowed into night. It's at 10 o'clock, 10:30 at benching. So if you daven Ma'ariv in middle of the meal, you can't, once you've started daven Ma'ariv, you made it Laila. You made it already base Lachodesh. It's not Rosh Chodesh anymore. You can't come back and say Yalla v'Yova because I started the meal during Rosh Chodesh, because you did something which is contradictory in between. Similarly, if I buy the chometz back on Motzei Pesach, so if I'm in the middle of the meal and I'll say Baruch HaMavdil ben Kiddush L'Chel, says I've already made it Motzei Pesach, I can't go back and bench and say Yalla v'Yova b'yem Chag HaMatzos hazeh. It's a stira. Once I've made it ready choil, I can't go back and say b'yem Chag HaMatzos. Until then, I could be blinked and say still it's an overflow. But once I've done something contradictory, so here's the question: if you started the meal on Purim and now it's already overflowed into Nacht, into Shabbos, and meanwhile you've made Kiddush, you haven't done Ma'ariv, but you've made Kiddush. Do you say Al Nisim in bench? So some say you shouldn't, but my understanding is that you should. And noch mehr, when you had a Yom Tiv, let's say Simchas Torah into Shabbos. The Farbrengen is going from Simchas Torah into Shabbos, and you're now benching, and you now in benching you come to recite, and you're saying recite b'yom HaShabbos hazeh, so it's already Shabbos. Can you go back now and continue and say Yalla v'Yova? Perhaps you should switch the order, say first Yalla v'Yova and then say recite. And they asked the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he said, you just follow the Seder in the Siddur, and you're going to say recite and Yalla v'Yova. Let's say for now Yalla v'Yova because of the beginning of the meal. And so certainly on a similar basis, one would say Al Hanisim in this, because of the beginning of the meal was was on Purim. Now you have here, this is a Meiri. The Meiri lived about 700 years ago and was published within the last 100 years. They found a lot of the manuscripts were in Parma in Italy. And the Meiri is in Ksubis, where it's talking more about Sheva Broches, about the Chasana, where it's the Zivuk Sheni, so you don't have 7 days, you only have the 1 day. And he says, "Onu vaviseinu noagim kepurim shecholi es be'erev Shabbos, shemaschilin mesudim mib'ed yom ad sheyikadesh hayom, u'posim mapu mekadshim, u'geimrim misasuda u'maskirin bo shel Purim mitam zeh." That he says it's okay, even if in the Poil we don't follow this for Sheva Brachas. We make a chasana of a second Zivuk Sheni. We make sure to, if it's a daytime chuppah, we finish off the meal also during the day. But he was a bit more lenient on this, and he says it's okay, like when Purim overflows. And why is that? He says when Purim overflows into Motzei Purim, but it's also Shtickle Purim. It's Chamisha Osor. It's also it's Shushan Purim. It also perhaps is deserving to say Al Nisim. So he's saying the same thing with the Sheva Brochas. They just got married, and there's 3 days of Simcha. Although it's only 1 day lebrocha, but there's 3 days of Simcha. So he kind of joins the two, and he says you could also say brochas by in the overflow of the meal from day into nightfall. Okay, so we won't follow that for Sheva Brochas, but we see here that the minig which he's testifying is that they would have the meal going from Purim into Shabbos, and they would say Al Hanisim in benching. Okay, we have the next thing is about shlachmonis. Someone was asking if you have guests at your table. First of all, are you yotzei shlachmonis? You invite someone for your meal. So it has the Gemara, this famous story. There were two Amiroim who were very poor, and having mechalfis to the sayu, they exchanged their meals with one another. So one way of learning that Gemara is that this year Reuven invited Shimon, and next year Shimon invited Reuven. So by inviting the guests to their table, they with that themselves they were already fulfilling shlachmonis. The next question is then I've got now guests at the table, and we're making the Suda half an hour before Shabbos, an hour before Shabbos, and everyone's got a place setting, some fish and some salad, and you say to each person, exchange your plate with the person sitting next to you. Are they Yotzei Shlachmonas? So apparently so, and what I saw in the contemporary Sefardi, Litvish Sefardi, that they have about in the yeshivas. Bocher yeshiva don't necessarily have the resources to go and buy shlachmonas, etc. So at the Sudas Purim in the yeshiva, they would exchange portions, their servings, exchange one with the other, and with that they would be Yotzei Shlachmonas. The Lubavitcher boys don't have that problem. They go out on Mivtzoim, and 5 minutes before the Shkia, they remember, oh, you haven't done Shlachmonas. So they exchange packets with one another. If any packets are left over, with them Mekayim Shlachmonas that way. I have a couple of minutes left, and I want to share with you fakampot, a dessert. And I mentioned this in Shul a couple of weeks ago, but it's this week's parsha. The end of this week's parsha is about the two parshas of Tefillin. And the other two parshas are in parshas Chanan and in Ekev, Shema v'hoyim shemoya. The tefillin have got 4 compartments, and they are written in the order as they appear in the Torah, and they are placed. So it says in the Gemara that you have Kadesh v'hoy kiviyach on the right side, and Shema v'hoyim shemoya mismoil on the left side. That means if you're looking at me, so you're the koira, you're leading. So on that will be Kadesh v'Kiviyacho, and then this is the Machlokes Rashi and Tosfos, Rashi Rabbeinu Tam, whether it goes Shema v'Hoyim Shemoya or Shema is the outer one, and v'Hoyim Shemoya is the inner one. This is the Machlokes. So you have in Kedushas Levi in Parshas Voice Chanan, he has a whole discussion about the difference between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam's, and he explains the difference between now from the Yamin HaKoirei, when you're looking to me, so you start from Kadesh, but from my right, the first one is the one on this side. So according to Rashi, the first one is to my right is V'hoyim Shemoya. According to Rabbeinu Tam, the first one is Shema. An easy way to remember: Shema has got a shin, and Kaddish is a shin, so the shin on the shalosh on the outside. So the two parashas which have the shin in the beginning are the outer ones, and the two v'hoyos on the middle. That's Rabbeinu Tam. So again, according to Rashi, I begin from my right. According to Rashi, I begin with v'hoyim shemoya. According to Rabbeinu Tam, I begin on my right with Shema. So he says like this: Shema is Kabbalos El Malchus Shemayim. V'hoyim shemoya is Kabbalos El Mitzvahs. Now, when it comes to chinuch, when you have a child, so you don't start necessarily with a child saying, Moshe Kibbutz Torah Misinai, and we have Yud Gilul Ikrim. You start with the child, tzitzis, and you tell them, say, broches, negelvase, moidani, whatever it may be. But there's the, the hidden agenda and the open agenda. The agenda which you're teaching a child is Kabbalah El Mitzvahs. As the child gets more understanding, then you'll also talk about the union of Kabbalah El Malchus Shemayim, of course, which is so important, but it's a later stage. So this is how the Baditchever learns. The Baditchever learns that Rashi is saying you start off with the V'hoyim Shemoya. To the right of the person who's wearing it, you start off with Kabbalah's mitzvahs. Then you'll go on to Kabbalah's El Malchus Shemayim. Rabbeinu Tam says you start off with Kabbalah's El Malchus Shemayim. So someone who sent this to me, brought to my attention, he says, very interesting. In training for army, he's Israeli, so he's talking about Tzahal, in training for army. So you've got various tasks, but you've got the frontline soldiers. So a lot of the time they're learning on how to use the equipment. All different types of modern equipment, fine. They have to learn. They spend a lot of time training how to use the equipment. They also have, so important, if you talk about 80-20, it's perhaps in time, 80% is spent on equipment and 20% is spent on motivation. In importance, perhaps it's 80 is motivation and 20% is the equipment. Because if soldiers are going to go without motivation, It's a Rahman al-Islam. So this is the difference between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. According to Rashi, the emphasis is on the mitzvahs, on the 80, and then you'll come to the 20. Rabbeinu Tam, his emphasis is the union of Kabbalah Sel Malchus Shemayim. That's the taka. It's only the 20% in time wise, but in importance it's 80. So therefore, the Rabbeinu Tam says you start off with the union of Kabbalah El Malchus Shemayim, and then you go on for the Kabbalah Shemayim. Then comes to mitzvahs. That's what this fellow was explaining, the Stickle of Kedushas Levi. And after that, I was thinking about this, how then, when the Rebbe said in Tofshin, Taka in the week of the Shiva, he says, the Rebbe says, if I had the ability, I would introduce that you should start wearing Bein Tam for Bar Mitzvah. So you understand, appreciate what the Rebbe is saying. If until then, and certainly in many other circles, Chassidische Kreisen, that Rabbeinu Tam is a later madrege, after Chasna, whatever, it's a later madrege. That, according to Rashi, it makes sense. It's The Rebbe is saying, no, even already by mitzvah, and the Rebbe said later, Tofshin and Aleph, I think, already from when you start by putting on tefillin, from the training, the 2-month training, already then the Rebbe is saying a child is able to, he's a keli, you should teach him Yesoides Hadas, the Inyan from Kabbalah, so Malchus Shemayim, the Inyan of, so that's that. In other words, the Rabbeinu Tam is also Rashi's. You spend 80%, and Rabbeinu Tam's is short, but the short time for Rabbeinu Tam is like high charge. It's Kabbalah, so Malchus Shemayim. So the Rebbe is saying that even young Bocharim, they're just turning Bar Mitzvah, they already kalim to be able to impress upon them the values of Yer Shemayim, of Kabbalah, so Malchus Shemayim, and so just Pashat Gishmaka der Her in this whole Inyan. Okay. So Rebbe Safran is asking, does hosting guests for the Sudas Purim count Shlechman? So the answer is yes. It does work, yes. Okay. So I think I'm going to stop here because it's already past, and I wish you all a gute Woche. And it's Vaduyas Peilos. We had Verbringens this Shabbos, and we had Motzei Shabbos, beautiful Verbringen with Rav Levi Weinberg, and tomorrow morning there's a Kriyas HaPidyon, a Pidyon Kloli, and Rabbi Cousin will be reading the Pidyon Kloli at the Ohel. It's going to work out in our time at 2:15 approximately, actually a bit later because 2:15 is Mincha, whatever, and then there's other Verbringens and Amallah Ha'oretz Verbringens that we should go from Misimcha L'Simcha to Simchas Olam Al Rosham, Malkeinu B'Roshenu, Yishalayim HaKodesh B'Meir Yameinu Mamish. A good Woche.
Oh, good Woche.
Shkoyach.
A good Woche, Shkoyach.
A große Shkoyach, danke, good Woche.
Good Woche. Good Woche.
Gute Woche, Dayan L Y Raskin. Gute Woche.
Gute Woche, gute Woche.
Gute Woche, Dayan L Y Raskin. I'm just sending you a text of a question about Tu B'Shvat.
Okay.
A gute Woche.
A gute Woche.
A gute Woche. A gute Woche, a gute Woche.
I am